Welcome back, everyone, to FIU's 6th Annual Hemispheric Security Conference. Again, my name is Brian Fonseca. I am the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at FIU's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and I'm honored to serve as your MC for the week. Before we get started, I want to give a quick shout out to our partners at U.S. Southern Command, the Atlantic Council, Council of the Americas, and of course the others across the university and outside that helped shape this year's program. Really grateful for the support that you all provided as we pulled together an exceptional group of intellectuals and thought leaders from across the world to ponder and sort of talk out the most prevailing and pervasive security issues facing this hemisphere. I also want to note that this conference was brought to you in part by LACS here at FIU, LACS U.S. Department of Education Title VI grant, and the Center for International Business Education and Research, two of the big sponsors that supported, pulling together the conference this year. I want everybody to know that's joining us at this conference is being brought to you in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And so if you need accessibility and language, please click the interpretation tab at the bottom and select one of the three languages, and you'll hear the conference, excuse me, you'll hear the conference in that language. And throughout the sessions today, if you have questions, please use the question and answers tab, also located at the bottom, to posit a question in your preferred language. And we'll make sure that the moderators kind of weave those questions in throughout the day. Of course, we'll be streaming today's panels on Facebook Live at our Facebook page at Gordon Institute. And so you can watch the conference stream live. It will also be preserved on Facebook and also on our YouTube channel. Yesterday's exceptional panels are already on YouTube. And so if you missed yesterday's event, please hop on our YouTube page and check out yesterday's exceptional panels with the thought leaders discussing the broader security landscape. Now it's my honor to welcome and introduce Mr. Waseem Mawla. Waseem is the Assistant Director of the Caribbean Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. He's an FIU alum, and I'm proud to announce he's also a non-resident scholar at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. Waseem, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. It's always great to be here. Good morning, and thank you to everyone tuning in today. It's great to be part of the FIU's Hemispheric Security Conference, especially because in recent years, I've attended as an FIU student every iteration of it. And now, as part of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center's family, I'm excited to be part of a continuing collaboration between our two institutions. This event holds even more significance because the founder of our center, Adrienne Arsht, has a deep connection and passion for Miami. As a philanthropist and visionary in Miami, Adrienne remains integral to our work in Latin America and the Caribbean and our connection to Miami as well. And as we look to remain connected, we cannot ask for better partners in FIU who have taken the initiative to bring together leaders across the Americas to discuss the security landscape. And with that being said, I'm happy to turn it over to Maria Fernanda Bozmoski, the panel moderator, for today's discussion on the impacts of climate change on security in Central America and the Caribbean. Mafi is the Deputy Director for Programs at the ALAC, and a leader on Mexico and Central American portfolios. She's widely known as an expert in these fields and is the perfect person to lead us through today's discussion.
Thanks, Waz, for those kind words, and good morning to everyone who's joining us for this exciting panel. As Brian mentioned, we will have time at the end of the panel for your questions, so please send them via the Zoom chat. If you're tuning in on other platforms, please use the hashtag HSC2021 to join the conversation. We all know that climate change is a perennial problem, but although it affects all countries across the globe, it has a disproportionate effect on a select few, such as Central America and the Caribbean. These two subregions are geographically diverse. For Central America, there are a wide array of climate effects such as droughts, annual hurricanes, and tropical storms. In fact, hurricane season is right around the corner. And for the Caribbean, whose states are small and vulnerable, it's a region that is affected by climate effects like hurricanes, volcanic effects, such as the recent eruption on the island of St. Vincent, flooding, acidifying oceans, and even plumes of dust that travel all the way from the Sahara Desert. For both regions, Climate change occurs amid an environment that is challenged by consistent security threats. Although this is more prevalent in Central America, climate change is known as a threat multiplier and amplifier, meaning that it aggravates existing stressors or can potentially induce new ones. And this means that as climate change worsens, security challenges can increase. And to discuss these topics today and the intersection of climate change and security, we have a fantastic panel here with us. First, we have Minister Mouynes, Minister Erika Mouynes, Panama's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister Mouynes is known as a leader in sustainable development and has held key positions in both the government and the private sector. Ministra, bienvenida. We also have Ambassador Selwin Hart, the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Climate Action and the Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team. The ambassador is a globally recognized leader and staunch advocate for the Caribbean in terms of addressing climate change. Last, but certainly not least, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, who is Trinidad and Tobago's ambassador to the US and permanent representative to the OAS, is an expert on security challenges and risks in the Caribbean. Now, panelists, as I've noted, climate change affects states and the hemispheric community in multiple ways, such as the annual hurricane season, which produces the intense storms, the ad hoc events like the volcanic eruption on St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then longer form effects such as changing precipitation patterns, rising temperatures and sea level rise, and extended droughts. In a few minutes, and I'd like to start with you, Minister Mouynes, can each of you, within the context of your current capacities, explain how climate change is affecting your state and also even the international community?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I think it's wonderful to generate this kind of discussion on this very important topic. From Panama's perspective, but I think more broader Central American view, as well as the Caribbean, I think I would have to start by saying that it's frustrating that we're not doing more to fight climate change, because from vulnerable states such as mine, we are doing our share. Take Panama's, for example, take Panama's case. We are one of the 3 countries in the world that is carbon negative. We're not aiming to be carbon neutral within 10 years or 15 years. We already are carbon negative. And that is Panama, which we depend on trade, we depend on commerce. So if we can do it, other more developed nations can certainly do it. But by the same token, we're one of the most affected. And climate change, creating all this extreme weather, as you were correctly pointing out. In the case of the Panama Canal, we've seen the worst years, just the last decade have been the worst years for the Panama Canal because of the lack of rain when we need it. So we are spending now billions of dollars to deal with the water management system in order to manage and mitigate this effort, this impact. So you have on one token, and I think I speak for several countries, we're doing our part, and in the other hand, we're being one of the most affected. So it is, I think, frustrating, and we're trying to generate more visibility on the matter. And in the midst of the pandemic, it is easy to lose sight of this very important topic. That's why we've made it a core principle within our foreign policy to generate more accountability for all states, and to actually also show some light in some very sensitive topics such as migration. You see all the displacement that is taken, and the lack of sort of some organized system. When we had the pandemic, the closed borders and all the migration that we got because they no longer can sustain their own agricultural systems. We have now all this almost humanitarian crisis waiting to explode because of this migration that is essentially dealing with the consequences of climate change that continue getting worse and for all these affected countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Ambassador Hart, you have a broader mandate in a sense as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General. What are you seeing?
Thank you so much. And let me first join the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Panama in thanking you for extending this invitation. And what we're seeing from the perspective of the United Nations is extremely alarming. The climate crisis is here. No continent, region, or country is immune. And adverse weather events and other climate impacts are becoming more intense and frequent. And climate-related disasters have increased sixfold over the past 5 decades. And the Latin American and Caribbean region definitely is not immune. We're seeing increased instances of sea level rise, more intense hurricanes, changing in precipitation patterns. We're seeing it across the entire hemisphere. And these climate-related impacts are already resulting in loss of lives, destruction and damage to physical infrastructure, economic dislocation, and displacement of peoples within and across national borders, and increased scarcity of basic needs such as food and water. And this will definitely increase in scope and intensity over time as the planet continues to warm. And the Secretary General has identified the climate emergency as the defining issue of our time. And it is the defining issue of our hemisphere. And we must, as a matter of urgency, prioritize 3 actions. And he has identified 3 priorities over the course of this, what he's called a make or break year for climate as we head towards COP26 in November. We must at all costs minimize the climate disruption, which means keeping the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement within reach. We must also align and transform public and climate finance to ensure that finance is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And third, and by no means least, we must secure a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience as we head towards Glasgow. And what do we mean by securing a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience? At current levels of warming, we're seeing in our region, I've seen 5 consecutive years of Category 5 hurricanes. We've seen unprecedented levels of destruction. I remember visiting the Bahamas in 2019 after Hurricane Dorian. And in the Bahamas, they experienced damage which amounted to 1/4 of the GDP of that country, which were in the United States would mean losing the United States, losing the economic output of the states of California, Florida, and Texas in one fell swoop. Countries of the Caribbean and the Central American region need significant access to new and additional climate finance to support them in building resilience to these increasing impacts of climate change. And this is something that the Secretary General has prioritized. When one looks at the adaptation finance gap, it is extremely, extremely alarming. Developing countries receive a mere $16.8 billion a year in adaptation climate finance. This is 21% of total climate finance flows. The adaptation costs for developing countries globally has been estimated at $70 billion a year. And it has been estimated that this will grow to as much as $300 billion a year. Many of the countries in our region lack access to low-cost climate finance and support, simply because of issues related to per capita income and other eligibility criteria. That needs to change as a matter of urgency as we seek to address the climate crisis.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart, for those, at the very least, eye-opening remarks. And now, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, as we wrap up this section, so to speak, of setting the scene, how is climate change affecting Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean?
Well, good morning, Maria, and please let me take just a few seconds to express my appreciation for this invitation. I think this is a very timely and important discussion, and it's a pleasure to join the Honorable Minister from Panama and my dear colleague, Ambassador Hart, with whom I worked here at the OAS a couple of years ago. My key message this morning really relates to whether or not we are seeing this problem accurately. And therefore, I want to refer to what in a very coherent and compelling statement delivered by the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Keith Crowley. He's the chair of CARICOM now. That was on the 26th of February. In fact, it was right here at the launch of the Atlantic Council's Caribbean Initiative, where he was speaking on the topic and to the topic of an outlook for resetting US CARICOM relations. In applauding President Biden on the return of the United States to the Paris Agreement, Prime Minister Rowley described climate change in these words, and I quote, as an existential threat to all of us in CARICOM. Now, there's no question that climate change is an existential threat. But to fully grasp the message that Prime Minister Rowley was attempting to deliver, we also need to accurately understand that from a multidimensional, non-traditional, and transnational perspective, the security impacts of climate change in our region represent not only a threat that's existential, but even more importantly, it's a source of vulnerability. Even before the threat fully manifests, it's a source of vulnerability that's both structural and systemic. According to internationally recognized authorities, vulnerability is described at the macro level as a risk which hampers development from exogenous shocks. And structural vulnerability particularly does not depend on a country's will to prevent those shocks, but they're exogenously determined and they're very enduring. So when we contemplate those elements of vulnerability, and in the first case, we talk about the inability of a state to prevent an externally generated hazardous situation like global warming, and in spite of your policy prescriptions. And secondly, when you consider the persistent and long-term nature of those hazards, you understand that the Caribbean is exactly in the position of structural vulnerability. In addition to that, the small island and low-lying developing states of the Caribbean, we experience structural vulnerability to climate change that's really based on things that we can't change. We can't change the fact that we happen to sit in the path of what have become increasingly extreme and destructive tropical climatic weather events. And I don't want to repeat the data presented already by Ambassador Hart, but I think the message is clear. In addition to that, geologically, our territories are mainly small islands. So when there are these events, there's not much place to go by way of evacuation. You have to stand where you are and face the effects. In addition to that, 90% of the developed urbanized areas in our islands are in coastal areas. Now, and therefore, we are particularly susceptible to flooding and sea level risk. Now, in addition to those structural sources of vulnerability in the face of climate change. There are also some systemic vulnerabilities, and those have in fact turned out to challenge us in the areas of access to affordable concessional financing, debt servicing, maintaining fiscal balance, especially when you contemplate the impact of one of these events on a country's GDP and their productivity. I think Ambassador Hart used the case of Hurricane Dorian to make the point very clearly. So therefore, what's the problem we ought to be looking at? And this is what we recognize in the region, and this is how we describe the problem as I close these opening remarks. Caribbean countries must find a pathway from vulnerability to resilience if we are to achieve human, national, and regional security. Building climate, disaster, and environmental resilience are imperative for realizing that aspiration. However, economic resilience and sustainable development are at the heart of our multidimensional security dilemma. That's our new security dilemma in the face of climate change. Small, vulnerable, and developing states like us in the Caribbean, we face a dilemma that particularly in a COVID-19 pandemic environment, we could describe as a resilient recovery security dilemma. So I'll stop here for now. Of course, there's much more that we could go on to say. I look forward to the discussion, and thank you again for the invitation to join this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer. And you were just talking about vulnerabilities, both structural and systemic. I want to ask a quick follow-up to the three of you. And that is, what areas are of most concern either now or in the future with getting access to water, food, other public goods due to climate change? Ambassador Hart.
Thank you. All of these areas are basically areas of massive concerns. And we've seen all over the world, including in this region, that massive destruction from storms, competition for food and water and other resources, that it pushes people into poverty. It causes death, injury, and widespread displacement. It drives outward migration. It severely disrupts school and work and adds additional stress to households and communities. And we see many of these dynamics play out in settings struggling with conflict around the world. It is no accident that 12 out of the 20 most insecure settings globally are also climate hotspots. And one of the really important lessons from research and policy in this area is that the links between climate change and security are indirect, nonlinear, and multi-dimensional, playing across various sectors in really different ways. And for the countries of the Latin American and Caribbean region, and specifically Central America and the Caribbean, who I consider countries on the front lines of the climate crisis, it is this lack of resources and fiscal space to recover from increasingly severe and frequent emergencies that's the real challenge that these regions, that the countries in this region faces. And I really fully agree with what Ambassador Phillips-Spencer says. If we are going to change this paradigm from vulnerability to resilience, rather than simply dealing with the symptoms, right? Rather than dealing with the symptoms of insecurity, we need to deal with the root causes. And $1 spent in helping countries to address the challenges of debt and climate is is better spent. $1 spent in building the resilience of people, empowering women, building, investing in climate resilient infrastructure, supporting countries to decarbonize their economies, building that economic and social resilience is a dollar that does not have to be spent on addressing the symptoms of poverty, be there violence, drug trafficking, or some of the other things that we see in the Central American and Caribbean region. So my central message is we need to invest in people and communities. Investing in people and communities, that is the biggest payoff that we can get in addressing the climate emergency in the Central American and Caribbean region.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. Minister Mouynes, would you like to comment on that point?
Yes, I think, that I was just considering how important it is to continue saying that it is an existential threat and that we're not saying that enough. I think that if we get one thing from this, is how important and how this discussion and many more that we need to have sort of as a matter of urgency, as Ambassador Hart was saying, they're extremely crucial, because at the end, if we don't understand the consequences of not doing or taking action, there are certain vulnerable states that they don't have years and years to then figure out what can we do. This is something that we need to do now. And when you're fighting poverty, the last thing that you need is more and more of these extreme weather conditions to make it even worse, right? So I think I second, and I go back to the sense that we need to create more accountability in the international community. This is not something that we can solve on our own. So just as the pandemic, this is exactly the same thing. And we need to start thinking as a community, and that we all need to do our part in this very important topic.
Thank you, Minister. And Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, what would you say are the areas of most concern now or in the future with respect to access to water, food, and public goods due to climate change?
Thank you very much, Maria. Both structural and systemic vulnerabilities retard development in the region. And therefore, what you have occurring is a drain on resources that would otherwise be applied to building both institutional and operational resilience and capacity building in vital areas. We're talking about energy security, food safety and security, and of course, in the current COVID context, public health security. Specifically, climate change now in our region, and sometimes it's probably not reported enough, and I think Ambassador Hart was making the point, it's negatively affecting exceptional efforts that we are making at coastal protection, preservation of biodiversity. Listen, we happen to sit in the tropics, and according to the State of the Tropics report from 2020, we account for more than 80% in the tropics of all of the world's biodiversity. We're having challenges in terms of being able to prevent coral bleaching. We're trying to promote climate disaster and environmental resilience. But when we're battling the consequences, as the minister pointed out, of climate change, it's a challenge to do that together. So we're trying to push back on vulnerability, build resilience at the same time as we're facing this existential threat. I don't think that people fully grasp, and that's why I say the problem. We need to be clear in our sight of the problem for small countries, and particularly low-lying coastal developing countries in the Caribbean, both in Central America and the island chain that make up the Caribbean. So I'll stop there. There's much more I could say. I want to make a reference at some point to something that I found very interesting in the State of the Tropics report. It says that tropical states like those in the Caribbean are, and I quote, at the nexus of biodiversity loss, climate change, emerging and persistent disease, rising prevalence of non-communicable diseases, urbanization, and globalization. Let's think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to shift gears a little bit and go with you, Minister Mouynes. Ambassador Phillips-Spencer was just talking about a drain on resources. And we know that climate change contributes to unemployment, economic inequality, rising rates of poverty, all things that benefit the membership of gangs and organized crime. And like you were saying at the beginning of your remarks, climate change is often cited as a driver of migration. And it's been increasingly a factor in migration. We're seeing a number of climate migrants now coming to the United States, for example. There is so much attention on the Northern Triangle right now and the root causes of migration. Can you assess for us, Minister Mouynes, the role that climate change has played in increasing domestic security challenges as it relates to gangs, crimes, and violence, and the implications for the region today and down the road?
Sure. I think I would have to start by saying that while there is a significant concern in the Northern Triangle migration, which is very specific, there's a second wave of migration, the one that we go through, that is extracontinental, arrives at the most southern part of the continent and starts making their way up by foot. We go through that, and to give you a sense, between the pandemic, climate change, and the displacement, the numbers that we're seeing, we went from seeing at our borders 600 at a month to now 1,000 a day. So in just a few months, imagine going from 600 a month to 1,000 a day. And we have small towns, you know, by the border in a very difficult forest to even live, of 300, which suddenly get flooded by thousands, and they're unable, clearly, are the structures to withstand such massive influx. And you have, I mean, at the end, nobody wants to leave their home. Any sort of migration is not because they want to do it, they're forced to do it. And you have to deal and treat them and care for all these individuals that are forced to take these very hard decisions in their lives. So I think I go back to the point on why is it that we're not seeing the urgency. And I think it's difficult to understand sometimes. You see, you know, like a hurricane or not enough rain, and you don't make the connection between emissions, for instance, because it's not direct. So because it's not evident, we don't actually understand what we're doing to the environment. And the environment, as Ambassador Phillips-Spencer was mentioning, in all aspects, right? The oceans, which are the biggest carbon sink in the world, I think they account for 90%, they are suffering tremendously. And again, maybe because it's not visible enough, the damage that they're suffering, or that the oceans are suffering, again, has consequences for all of us, particularly all those nations that are surrounded by water. We're hosting our Oceans Conference next year, which is the biggest conference on oceans in Panama, with the hope of gaining momentum. But at the end, it's not Panama alone, it's not the Caribbean alone, it's not Central America. We need everybody to set their eyes, understand what is happening, and to do our part in the solution.
Thank you, Minister Mouynes. I've received a question from the audience, and I want to use this opportunity to keep incentivizing and encouraging all of you who are connected, all 300 plus of you, to send in your questions. This question is, and I'll leave it, whoever wants to respond, is what role, if any, do militaries and security organizations play in mitigating the effects of climate change in the hemisphere? And if a role is indeed appropriate, how should we think about military or security forces' readiness in the future? Who wants to take that easy question?
So I've put my hand up, and let me.
Oh, you're on mute, Ambassador.
Yeah, so let me take the first strike at this question. This is an excellent question. In fact, in 2016, Trinidad and Tobago hosted the 12th Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas. And in fact, at that conference, the issue of contemplating and really studying the problem of environmental and climate change effects on both the institutional and operational dimensions of the armed forces across the hemisphere. Both Minister Mouynes and Ambassador Hart referred to direct and indirect effects. And this is how you begin to understand where a role for the military and security establishments, institutions, is very important. You know, so the Center for Climate and Security referred to climate change as a threat multiplier. Now, once you're in the military world, that assumes a particular spotlighted focus of attention. And therefore, those direct and indirect climate change security impacts, they encompass areas where militaries and security institutions operate. So you're talking about the broad range of existing threats to border security, critical infrastructure protection, and then you have the compounded effects of migration-driven and technology-enabled transnational organized crime. So what you're having has already been described by the Honorable Minister. You have this massive increase in migration flows together with a transnational organized criminal enterprise that's just leveraging technology more and more now to try and create threat multiplied effects for military forces. And of course, then you have the trafficking in all the manifestations, human trafficking, guns trafficking, drugs, whatever. That is where, you know, the preparedness and the readiness of military establishments needs to be given some more attention, that you're operating now in a changed environment of a climate change circumstance where you have to pay attention to issues of adaptation. Let me give you one anecdote and I'll stop. So Trinidad and Tobago sits very close to Venezuela. In my final years in my military career, a few years ago, we noticed that rising sea levels enable drug smugglers to use waterways in previously inaccessible areas to quickly ensconce and hide some of their trafficking operations in mangrove areas and swamps, where suddenly the flat bottom boats could give them a places to hide. I mean, we didn't have that to deal with before. Here we now having to deal with those types of challenges. And so that's my first response to that question. Excellent question. And I look forward to more as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer. Ambassador Hart, did you want to jump in as well?
Well, yes, and that anticipatory function, I think, will be increasingly needed by militaries and security professionals around the world. I also wish to emphasize as well, and Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, we really worked on this, where we also need our regional organizations, like the Organization of American States, that has this really broad mandate to address issues of regional peace and security, development, and human rights, really to become more of a forum for the exchange of best practice experiences around through its various organs on the linkages between climate and security. And you know, no regional organization, be it the OAS or the Inter-American Development Bank or any of the major regional organizations, all of them should have climate firmly embedded on their agendas over the course of the coming months and years, and should be crafting responses within the context of their respective mandates. And there's no organization better than the OAS in our hemisphere to really address in a very comprehensive manner what are the best options and hemispheric responses to addressing the interlinkages between climate and security. So one of my recommendations, and Ambassador Phillips-Spencer knows that I really try to push this, and I'm happy that under his leadership of the Committee on Hemispheric Security, that he was really able to advance this. We really need our regional organizations to be better engaged so that we can have some of these discussions, and the professionals can have these discussions and exchange ideas and best practices and options on how to address these challenges.
Thank you. Minister Mouynes, would you like to jump in as well? And before you do, we have a follow-up question to that, which is concretely, what could the military do for a threat like climate change? Are there any examples elsewhere in the world where military is taking on this role? But Minister Mouynes, I want to give you an opportunity to comment on that.
Yeah, I agree with what both ambassadors said. I think that at the end, the collaboration, which goes, not only you have the organizations, but again, the more that we work on this together, it goes as far as, for instance, data sharing, which is what came to mind when he was referring to the OAS. The more data that we share within countries, the better prepared that we are, and we can manage it better. So it goes more to the point of prevention. If you're prepared, if you share the data as necessary, the intelligence, even for instance, on weather that we were just discussing, we just installed the first institute to deal with a proper tracking of weather. And we are going to have also a collaboration on the satellite with Europe. And at the end, it's just to be able for Panama to share the data with a more accurate data on all these weather conditions with the rest of the Caribbean and Central America, which at the end is key. So whether you're talking military, whether you're talking weather, again, it goes back to the same point. The more that we're working on this together, that we're able to prevent and not deal with the consequences, the better equipped that we are.
Thank you, Minister Mouynes. And Ambassador Hart or Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, did you want to comment on concretely what is the role of the military with respect to climate change?
Ambassador Hart, would you want to go first, or should I go ahead?
Well, there's only one former general on this panel, and it's not me.
Oh dear. Okay. All right. So this is a great question, and in fact, so I referred to Trinidad and Tobago's focus on raising awareness and sensitization of the need for armed forces in the hemisphere to pay attention to climate change and its effects in terms of the security environment. And at that time, when in fact I was still in service, and we looked carefully at the work that was being done in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Now, ASEAN, as you know, really stood up its focus on this after the tsunami of 2004, because the effects of the tsunami at that time really brought into stark reality how all of society, all institutions, including the military, had to become much more intelligent in contributing to the effort at mitigating and adapting to climate change effects. So at the most basic level, just simply as a military establishment, reducing the contribution to global warming. Yes, because militaries they generate a fair amount of energy burn. So that's very much at home. But in addition to that, in ASEAN, they actually set up as their defense ministers, the ASEAN defense ministers, they created a network and an organization where now in ASEAN, they share information, as the minister was saying. It's important to share experiences, share learnings, engage in real focused research on how do we, as military institutions and security agencies, become much more intelligent to this. And I agree with Ambassador Hart he and I work together, and no surprise where he is now. I'm sure he is advocating for increased sharing of lessons learned, sharing recommendations on how we must make our military institutions much more intelligent. This might be a topic for a separate panel, so I'll just stop there for now. But ASEAN is one of the areas where we could look to. They really got ahead. Bear in mind that, for instance, the Center on Climate and Security was only established in 2010. So in terms of really studying this problem of the link between climate and security, it's fairly recent, but we need to intensify, as the minister said, and with greater urgency, address this problem. Thank you.
And if I may add, may add, and I fully support everything that Ambassador Phillips-Spencer said. And militaries also have an extremely important role to play in post-disaster response and recovery efforts. And we've seen this
I think Ambassador Hart's internet has frozen.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. The roles of militaries or the role of militaries in the immediate disaster response effort must also be emphasized as well, because usually after these extremely disruptive and destructive hurricanes or extreme weather events, usually they are the only ones who are able to get on the ground to provide immediate response and relief to peoples and communities. And certainly in the Caribbean, through the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, we have, or the region has pretty, really good protocols in terms of the response of the militaries and the armed forces. But I believe that needs to be broadened, given that we're seeing an acceleration in the frequency and the intensity of these extreme weather events.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. And that was actually a question that was in the Q&A as well about the OAS and international response to the back-to-back hurricanes in Honduras last year and the military rescue response there and lessons learned. And like you're saying, that is something that we've seen. I remember in 2005 with Katrina, the Mexican military stepped in and helped in the United States. And so yeah, what you're saying right now, we've seen this in the past. We've seen it in action. We've seen the international community come and help. Let's see now. I want to, again, shift gears a little bit, leave the military aside for a second. And Ambassador Mouynes, going back to climate change depleting resources, can you talk specifically about the effect that this has on populations in Central America? We've talked a little about security implications of this, but how do we fight? How do we avoid this becoming an opportunity, a breeding ground for gangs and organized crime?
Yeah, so it's hard to solve with just one measure. I think the first thing that you need to do, at least in Panama, we're seeing as a more integral and holistic. And again, it is now for us, we say that we have now a green foreign policy because it is a top priority for us. And we're trying to sort of generate the message that it should be, but it's not just foreign policy. That's not enough. So for instance, our Ministry of Agriculture went from policies that were not taking into account the environment to be extremely conscious and how to deal this sustainability concept. The more that you teach your population how important it is that if you deplete your resources, it's great for that one moment, but that you need some form of sustainability. That concept involves education. So again, the more integral or holistic approach that you have within states to deal with this, the more effective that you'll be. But at the end, the problem is, we cannot deal or say from the international perspective, well, we all came to the aid because of the hurricane that happened in Honduras or in the Caribbean. We need to be preventing this, not mobilizing ourselves when it happened and dealing with the crisis. You never go back to the way you were. It takes years for any of these countries to truly recover. And again, the inequality gap grows bigger and bigger. So I think most of our efforts really should be focusing at preventing and not dealing with the consequences.
Thank you, Minister Mouynes. And to that point, we have also a question on the Q&A, which I think is more of the moral questions surrounding climate change. And like you're saying, we shouldn't be reacting, we should be preventing. The question for all of you is, should countries with a larger carbon footprint bear a larger responsibility to assist countries with smaller carbon footprints? What do you think, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer?
Great question again. Really enjoying the discussion. Let me point out 4 areas where I think the larger countries can assist small countries. And this is separate and apart from, of course, building our economic resilience. And I spoke to the challenges of access to concessional financing, debt relief, and all of those things that really and truly retard and inhibit our capacity to build our own resilience. Let me talk about 4 areas. One, and in fact, all of these 4 areas that I'll list now are areas where also the military can and should become more involved proactively. 1, in the area of coastal protection. 2, forest conservation. In Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, our government has mobilized a lot of our youth in our program. In fact, it goes back to an experience here in the United States many, many years ago, called the Civilian Conservation Corps. It is run and in fact administered by our national military. Yes, so that's another area. 3rd, biodiversity preservation. Listen, we live in an ecosystem. And if we don't take time now to focus on preservation of our biodiversity, the risks, and the minister spoke about the ocean. I mean, there's biodiversity in the ocean that we have not yet even begun to discover. We ought to be much more aggressively engaging in how do we preserve that ocean biodiversity, for example, and other areas. Because at the end of the day, that's how we proactively hold back on the destructive effects of climate change. And finally, of course, and Ambassador Hart spoke to this, the disaster resilience promotion. And so the United States, for instance, in April 2019, launched Disaster Resilience Partnership, the Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership, which we're happy to know is going to continue because that's where it lands, moving from the vulnerabilities to resilience as we face this existential threat. So that's what I would offer by way of a response. If we could get assistance from the bigger countries to cover those 4, I think we make major progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. Would you like to jump in?
Yes, and the unfortunate paradox of the climate crisis is that those countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis are the ones most negatively impacted. And when one looks at the cumulative emissions of countries from Central America and the Caribbean, I dare say it's less than 0.5% of total global emissions. Yet these countries have borne the brunt in our hemisphere of climate impacts. And the good thing, and you hear it from the distinguished minister from Panama, these countries are still leading the hemisphere in terms of decarbonizing their economies. These are the countries with the most ambitious climate goals across the hemisphere, and in many instances across the world. Countries like Panama and Costa Rica and Guatemala, Honduras, countries of the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica are leading the global charge to decarbonize their economies and to build climate resilience, at times with very little or no support from the international community. And this is why my boss, Antonio Gutierrez, has been really pushing to prioritize keeping the 1.5 degree goal within reach, but ensuring delivery of finance commitments, including the $100 billion goal that was promised a decade ago in Copenhagen, and also securing this breakthrough on adaptation and resilience. And as I said earlier, it's absolutely unfair, and it is not charity. It's not only doing the right thing morally, it is an investment in a resilient and secure hemisphere. A resilient and secure and prosperous hemisphere is not charity. It's an investment in our hemisphere. It's a hemispheric public good. And there are many simple things that can be done. We need to ensure that all countries in the hemisphere, from Panama, Costa Rica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, have access to low cost and grant financing to build resilience. These countries when I sat on the board of the Inter-American Development Bank, I was extremely alarmed to find out that in many instances, these countries don't have access to grant and concessionary resources because of archaic rules around per capita income. And these are countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. That needs to change. And we really need to push our hemispheric partners really to make a strong case for ensuring that countries in the hemisphere have access to grant and low-cost climate finance to enable them to prevent and build resilience to climate change. And the G7 summit that will be happening in June represents a critical moment for us to see enhanced commitment and support to the needs of these countries. And I really would encourage all of you who to really encourage our hemispheric partners who are part of the G7, really to make a very strong case for the countries of the Caribbean and Central America in terms of access to climate finance.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart, and I love that call to action. Minister Mouynes, I want to ask you this question here from Margarita Mexicanos about, do you consider that it is necessary to design and implement a protocol to accelerate and make international cooperation more expedient, more expedited in the cases in emergencies? Because sometimes the bureaucracy of governments does not allow for help to arrive in time.
Yes, so I recognize the point on how to deal with bureaucracy when at the end, sometimes you do have a lot of states that want to help, but just the mechanism to connect and to make the help a reality is another matter. I think, again, going to the point on prevention is one of the most important ones. We have in Panama a center, humanitarian logistic hub. And through this logistic hub, through the pandemic and with the hurricanes, we've helped over 30 countries, 80 tons. And it's not just being Panama, but all the organizations that are here, the Red Cross, the UN, et cetera, that are able to, because you have already a hub, you can then distribute more efficiently goods and the most needed medicines and so forth. I think that whether it's a protocol or something, you have to be thinking, what exactly do you need in order to be prepared to make it efficient? Because there's always the question, we ourselves, we were trying to, with the volcano eruption, trying to connect with other countries, because if you start taking one plane for each country to try to deliver, it is extremely expensive or heavy, and you know the burden of how to deal with the freight surges. But if you pull all those together and you have, you know, airlines that are already committed to do that, it makes it so much easier, where you have this go-to, okay, this is how we're gonna do it, this is how we're gonna pull, and in X amount of days, you can be delivering that very necessary aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Mouynes. Let's shift gears once again. And I'd like to ask this question to all three of you, but I'll start with you, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer. If we do get to a point where there is a competition for resources and governments are unable to provide them, what will this mean for governance and the legitimacy of those in power? Ambassador Phillips-Spencer.
Thanks very much. And, you know, at the end of the day, one of the most direct effects of climate change, well, potential direct effects of climate change on security is where you have the emergence of conflict. And, you know, some people refer to water wars and that type of thing. And, you know, at the end of the day, those fundamental human needs and human rights come into stark focus. And therefore, to the extent that any government in face of the effects of climate change becomes unable to guarantee the provision of those rights and needs to its citizens, you have conflict. We've seen enough instances of that. Of course, one obvious effect is migration, where people are just fleeing, looking for the next place where they can survive. You know, the imperative of cooperation comes to the fore. And I know that in the construct and within the framework of UN OCHA, the concept of complex humanitarian emergencies, I think if we don't act enough, you know, this is the decade of action. Well, one clear area for action in this decade is climate change and the effects of climate change. If we don't act swiftly enough, we will find ourselves having to deal more and more and respond to complex humanitarian emergencies that introduce conflict and therefore threaten the legitimacy and, of course, the credibility of countries that are simply unable to build the capacity and resilience to guarantee those needs and human rights to its citizens. So that's the risk that we take. You know, within the hemisphere here, there is a convention, it's the Inter-American Convention to Facilitate Disaster Assistance. And I have to say that the performance by member states in terms of ratifying that convention is very weak. In fact, it was introduced since 1991, but there are less than 10 member states that have actually ratified it. But at the end of the day, we have to find ways to cooperate, one. Two, to prepare ourselves for having to deal with more and more flashpoints of conflict areas with all of the effects, migration and the gangs that emerge to assume ascendancy where, you know, there's a vacuum. I mean, John Rapley spoke about this a lot, speaking about the dons and the gang leaders and the people who literally take over areas simply because the resilience has not been built to manage the effects where they threaten the survivability of people in any country. Small countries in particular have to be very wary of this. And so I would once again want to to commend the United States for launching the US-Caribbean Resilience Partnership and look forward to that as one area where we could push back on this, as well as part picking up the Inter-American Convention on facilitating disaster assistance, and let's cooperate more. Panama has the hub for the logistics supply for some of these emergencies. How do we create more centers of excellence like that across the region to ensure that if those situations do occur, which we of course would prefer to prevent, we are able to cooperate effectively to deal with that. Haiti in 2010 was a case where there were many lessons learned. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer. Something urgent has come up, and Minister Mouynes will have to peel off in the next 4 minutes. So I do want to give you an opportunity, Minister Mouynes, if you want to comment on this quickly, or if you have any closing remarks before you have to log off.
Yes, thank you. I think I am grateful for this opportunity. I commend the Atlantic Council on doing this, and I think we need so many more. This is sort of like an urgent campaign that we need to create and sort of gain the momentum required. As Ambassador Hart said, this might be the year of make it or break it. If we don't act now, then we're only going to be dealing with consequences, with mitigation of how to aid every time there is even more and more devastating consequences. So we are appealing to everybody in terms of doing their part, in terms of accountability, in terms of understanding the real consequences of this. And I love, again, the term of the existential crisis and threat that this is presenting for all of us. And it might be comfortable for some that are not in this direct impact, and to recover every year catastrophe after catastrophe from this, it's simply impossible. So the consequences of displacement, migration, of poverty, even greater, again, are all a direct consequence of not properly assessing and dealing with this very important issue. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Minister, for being with us today, and really appreciate your insights and your comments, and hope it's not the last time. Thank you again. Ambassador Hart, did you want to comment? Sure. on the unrest? Go ahead.
Thanks. And I definitely agree with everything that my colleagues have said. It's absolutely important that at the national and regional levels, we build the technical capacity that's needed for us to support and help countries to better anticipate many of these events before they occur, and building that capacity at the regional and sub-regional levels will be absolutely essential, be it capacity to anticipate a drought and the potential impact that it will have on migratory patterns, the impact that it will have on crop yields, etc., which could then set off a chain of other challenges, as we have seen across this hemisphere. So building that capacity at the national, and for those countries who might not have that capacity at the national level, at the sub-regional and regional levels, will be absolutely crucial, and investments need to be made in that area. The second point is that we also need to look at financial innovation. And there are many examples of financial instruments that can be used, which help to support peoples and communities most affected by impacts. And I will just give you one example, which is under development by the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, the CRIF, which has served as a global and regional best practice and a model for helping countries to address some of the immediate financing needs from climate and other extreme weather events. And they've been working on a very innovative product called COAST. It's a Caribbean Oceans and Aquaculture Sustainability Facility, which is the first ever parametric insurance product for the fisheries sector. And it provides coverage to fisher folks and others involved in fisheries to enable them to recover quickly, immediately after a hurricane. You know, it's a small scale program, but geared primarily to fisher folks, primarily in Grenada and in St. Lucia. But it's really served to help these communities to respond and recover in the aftermath of climate and other extreme weather events. And I know Criff had also worked on a similar product for farmers in the agricultural sector to support and help them to deal with drought or other extreme weather events. So a combination of anticipating potential impacts, but also financial innovation so that peoples and communities are supported during these difficult times, and they're not forced to resort to other means to earn income, to feed themselves and their families. It's absolutely, absolutely critical. And the investments needed are not great. If that $1 in investment in a program like this, I am certain prevents hundreds of dollars in costs to address any potential security-related issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. And there's some literature as well on how investing in pandemic preparedness is so much more efficient and makes much more sense than reacting and responding to a pandemic. And I guess in a way, could even say that climate change is like a pandemic, right? It's affecting everyone around the world. Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, I want to ask you, because Ambassador Hart was just talking about fisheries and livelihoods. Since rising temperatures can increase the ocean acidification and can cause damage to fisheries and ecotourism, sectors that are critical to livelihoods and economic growth. Now, as we're talking about post-COVID-19 economic reactivation, how can the Caribbean respond through the different mechanisms or individually, and how can climate action be a part of the solution?
Right. So, you know, one of the areas, so this is the bridge between the military capability and a clear mission of maritime patrolling, which, yes, we tend to think of that principle in the context of the counter-trafficking missions. But there's also the issue of just patrolling the maritime space to ensure that there's no overfishing of resources, and that, you know, we don't have the type of incursions into the exclusive economic zones where there are illegal things happening. So that's one dimension. Then, of course, you have the other threats of the acidification and so on. And, you know, I go back to the point that the livelihood of many of our towns and villages, you know, those are in the coastal areas. Hello? Oh, there.
We're here.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, I think I had a bit of a freeze. I don't know what was missed, but I think you got the maritime patrolling. Yes, okay. But then there's the issue of the acidification. And one of the things in small island states in particular is a combination of how we use our coastal areas for livelihoods for fishermen and fisherfolk, but also how our inland water sources and water resources become very valuable, whether it's for some types of crop production to maintain the agricultural production and so on, and offer some food security. But also you have those water courses that again flow into areas where we might be attempting freshwater type production, fish farming and that type of thing. So I can't propose much more. I think Ambassador Hart is right onto it. I'm interested in hearing some more about coast. I will be pursuing some more information about that. But I think that, again, the imperative of cooperating, and this is where our international partners who are able to kind of assist us in developing this capacity to address those concerns. I go back to coastal protection as a main area for focus, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Something we haven't really talked about is the role of the private sector in dealing with this climate emergency and being a partner for governments. It's not only all on the public sector. So I want to take a moment and focus on that. Are there any examples of successful public-private partnerships that are not only responding to the climate change emergency, but are taking proactive steps to address and mitigate? Any examples from your respective countries or that you have seen in your respective capacities? Ambassador Hart, I'll start with you.
Thank you. And if we are to address this climate crisis in the manner demanded by the science, it will need all of government, all of economy approaches. And the role of the private sector will be absolutely crucial in ensuring that the goals of the Paris Agreement remain within reach. And what we're seeing now around the world is an unprecedented level of mobilization around the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement and around the net zero goal of that agreement. But it started with governments. It started with governments, first of all, finalizing the Paris Agreement in 2015. And over the course of the last year, we now see countries representing 70% of carbon emissions committing to net zero by 2050. And the summit that was recently hosted by President Biden on Earth Day really helped to turn the tide even further towards a net zero future. And we're seeing, as part of this mobilization moment, an increasing number of cities, financial institutions, and major businesses committing to net zero. At last count, about a fifth of the largest public companies around the world have committed to net zero. We see asset owners, asset managers, banks, insurance companies also committing to this ambitious goal of net zero by 2050. But the reality is that we need this space to gather even more, and all private sector entities must be part of this transition towards net zero. As it relates to the countries of Central America and the Caribbean, the reality is that in order for us to bridge this public and private divide, it will require some degree of support from the multilateral development banks, and in particular, the multilateral development banks operating in our region. The Inter-American Development Bank, they have a 30% target of climate finance, providing at least 30% of their overall support to the region is devoted to climate change. That's a floor. We understand that the bank is working to align itself with the Paris Agreement and make an announcement before the end of the year. And this will send an extremely, extremely and powerful signal to the private sector of the region, because we need the MDBs to serve as a catalyst for mobilizing greater sources of private finance across the region. So this effort by the bank to align itself with the goals of the Paris Agreement will be extremely useful. And finally, we've seen some good examples. Jamaica has been able to attract a significant amount of investments in the renewable energy sector. One of their projects is producing or has produced renewable energy at a cost of 8 cents per kilowatt hour, 8 cents per kilowatt hour, while the regional average is about 3 or 4 times that amount. A really good, well-structured private-public partnership. So there are examples in our region of really great private-public partnerships, but it needs a catalyst, it needs an incentive, and that catalyst must be the multilateral development banks, and in particular, not putting any pressure on my former colleagues at the IADB, but the IADB will have a massive, massive role to play in driving this transition in our hemisphere.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. The question of incentives for the private sector is key. Ambassador Phillips, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yeah, thanks very much. I fully agree with all that Ambassador Hart has said, in particular his focus on the commitment of the private sector to net zero. But we also are seeing some good signs where, for instance, in Trinidad and Tobago, our major energy corporations have in fact adopted areas. So for instance, in Southeast Trinidad and Tobago, where much of our biodiversity is located, in the swamp areas and so on. So one major corporation, Global Energy Corporation, for instance, has literally adopted the southeast of our island, and so they help with all of the coastal protection and all of those types of projects. But there are 2 areas that I want to add as well. I think it's time for the private sector to become much more engaged in the discussion and, of course, decisions and delivery of just energy transition, the just energy transition. So as we're transitioning from the fossil fuels to the renewables, I think the private sector has to be much more engaged in supporting not just the corporate dimension of that, but also the social dimension of that. The corporate social responsibility, I think, could be displayed there. Finally, in the Caribbean specifically, in fact, from the 7th to the 9th of June, in a few weeks, the Trinidad and Tobago Energy Conference, it's an annual conference hosted by our Trinidad and Tobago Energy Chamber, will be hosted. And the theme for that is leading the Caribbean energy transition. Understand the importance of that energy transition in the region to help with pushing back, and enabling climate adaptation and mitigation. But also, now that is going to be occurring while we have an increase in investments in the energy sector in 2 countries in the southern Caribbean, Guyana and Suriname. Those are major, major investments. And so again, making sure that the private sector, even as they pursue these new investments, that they are also balancing those investments with an investment in enabling and ensuring that we have a responsible and just energy transition. I think that's key. We need to bring them to the table of that discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have approximately 4 minutes, and I want to ask the 2 of you if you have any closing remarks, any parting thoughts for the audience, anything that we didn't cover that should have been brought up. The floor is yours, Ambassador Hart. You're on mute.
Sorry, we've been doing this for almost a year. We still all fall for this. So we're 14 days before the start of the hurricane season, 2 weeks before the start of the Atlantic hurricane season. And this year's hurricane season promises to be just as devastating as the last 5 or 6 years, where we've seen for the very first time Category 5 hurricanes in 5 consecutive years. So this continues to pose significant challenges to the countries of the Central American region and the Caribbean. This year, we also have the COVID-19 crisis, and these countries have been hardest hit, not in terms of deaths, etc., but have been hardest hit because of this very structure of their economies by the economic fallout from the cessation of tourism and other forms of income generating activity for the countries of the Caribbean and the Central American region. In addition to that, there is a looming debt crisis. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, you had 11 out of the 14 Caribbean countries in the Caribbean classified as highly indebted countries, and COVID has further exacerbated the debt challenges. So you have COVID, climate, and debt crises, singular crises on their own, but all intersecting at this really defining moment for our region. And I believe that we need to use these intersecting crises as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Obviously, working with our international partners to define a new future, a resilient, secure, and sustainable future. And I hope that the international community and our international partners, especially the largest and wealthiest countries in our hemisphere, really support the countries of the Caribbean and Central America through these overlapping crises. It's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. If we fail, if these countries fail to get the support of the hemisphere and the international community, we could be looking at lost decades for the Caribbean and the Central American region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hart. Ambassador Phillips-Spencer, you have 30 seconds for your remarks.
I often reflect on the slogan 1.5 to stay alive. And in the Caribbean, you know, we are inescapably exposed to all of the effects of climate change. There's a presence and persistence of both structural and systemic vulnerabilities, and we face a real new security dilemma. Amidst COVID-19, we are trying to pursue resilient recovery, and that presents a security dilemma, because how now do we balance our sustainable development aspirations with our capacity to ensure security, multidimensional security in the face of the existential threat of climate change? We need to work together. We need the help of international partners. This is a high priority. I agree with Ambassador Hart and the UNSC. This is a make or break year. Let's start this year and make this a decade of action that counts for us. Thanks very much, and it was a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Ambassador Phillips-Spencer. Once again, thank you, Ambassador Hart. Thank you for this very enlightening conversation. I think we could have been here all day talking about these issues. But now I will yield the floor to Brian Fonseca, who's the director of the Gordon Institute for Public Policy. Brian.
Thanks, Mafe. What a brilliant job you did moderating. So thank you so much for driving us through an exceptional conversation with some really fascinating thought leaders that are at the forefront of a really complex, and I agree with the ambassador, existential threat facing all of our nations. So I'm grateful to you, our speakers, of course, Wazim, Jason, the Atlantic Council team, for all you do at the forefront of security in the hemisphere, and you're an exceptional partner to our university, so thank you. Our next panel is going to be exciting. It's a fireside chat between FIU's acting director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center and the former president of Costa Rica, President Luis Guillermo Solis, and the current Costa Rican Vice President, FC Campbell Bell. So that's going to kick off shortly at 1 p.m. And so we're going to take a break. But before we take a short break, I want to make a shameless plug. As I mentioned yesterday, I only get a few of those a day. And so I'm going to make those shameless plugs now. I want to point out two really important programs here at FIU in this important space of climate change and environment. The first is our Extreme Events Institute and its Disaster Risk Reduction of the Americas program. It's a program that's highly sought after here at the university that focuses on cutting edge research in the area of disaster risk reduction. And the Hurricane Center or Wall of Wind really focused on building disaster risk reduction practices across the Americas. Check them out at eei.fiu.edu. Again, that's eei.fiu.edu. I also want to recognize the work of FIU's Institute for Environment and its Sea Level Solution Center. In fact, the Institute for Environment was recognized earlier this year by the National Science Foundation when it was awarded one of only 3 universities. When the National Science Foundation awarded only 3 universities in the country, in the US, FIU, University of Puerto Rico, and University of Hawaii, funding to better understand the impact of global climate change on tropical ecosystems. And so you can check out the Institute for Environment at environment.fiu.edu. Again, that's environment.fiu.edu. And so with that, we conclude our first panel of the day, and I look forward to seeing you all in 30 minutes for our next session. Thank you.